Thank you for being here. Very excited to have this conversation. I'm going to do my best Rob impression and start with what is his traditional first question, which is, what are you working on at the moment, and why do you think it's especially important?
So I'm doing lots of different work at DFID, but let me talk a little bit about some research work I'm doing, which is evaluating a mass media campaign, a radio campaign run by Development Media International, which is an NGO here in the UK, and they are doing a family planning program on radio in Burkina Faso. So I think it's really important to look at radio and mass media because it's a very cheap way to reach a large number of people, and you can make sure that the message is accurate and consistent. The problem is that it's very hard to evaluate radio for exactly those reasons, because one radio program reaches millions of people at the same time, so it's very hard to randomize. Now, it happens that Burkina Faso is kind of one of the few places in the world where one can evaluate this effectively. It's also true that at DFID we're worrying a lot about the Sahel. It's an area that hasn't had a lot of UK interest until recently, and also family planning is a hugely important issue, because if you get the demographic transition right, it can have incredible benefits for women, for economic development, and for the health of children.
So why is it that is more testable in Burkina Faso? Is that a language group issue?
So it's a complex series of factors that means that you have a lot of different radio stations across Burkina Faso, and that indeed have different languages, so there's kind of less spillover, and so you can randomize at the level of the radio station. You also have people who are so poor that they can't afford radios, so we're randomly handing out radios to women who don't have radios, so we have kind of two levels of randomization, both at the radio station and within a radio area. Some women already have radios, some women are given radios, and some aren't. So it's kind of a conglomeration of things that allow you to be able to test.
Well, we'll probably come back to that in a minute when we get to the section on randomized control trials in general. We're going to try to cover a variety of areas here, including your views on careers in policy, advice for audience members who are interested in policy careers, the role of evidence in general in aid work. But I thought we might also just kind of go back to the beginning of your career and maybe just give us a sketch of kind of how your career has developed. You studied economics as an undergraduate and then began your career at the Treasury,
Yep.
And then it's taken a lot of different turns from there. So tell us all about that.
I think there's some benefit in telling my story. It sounds very self-centered to talk about my story, but I think it's useful to show that careers don't always have to be one-directional, and they can take many turns. I think it's kind of interesting to be doing this in an 80,000 hours podcast where people are thinking really seriously about what's the best thing to do, and in some ways my career's been a bit random. But I think it's both, right? We both have to think seriously about what our next step is, and also realize that stuff happens in life. So I started out, as an undergraduate, I was very interested in development economics and very interested in thinking about how I could contribute to, addressing the issues of global poverty. And I spent a summer traveling around Kenya, talking to lots of people in the aid sector, and got really depressed and thought, A, a lot of things don't seem to be working, and B, what do I know? What honestly could I bring to these complicated issues? I'm 21, I don't know anything about Kenya. So I decided not to go into development, and I went instead into the Government Economic Service, which is a special training position within the government that trains you to use analytical skills to address policy issues. So I did that at the Treasury. I worked on domestic policy. I worked on reform of the health service, trade policy, monetary policy, all sorts of different policies. But I got a fantastic training in how to use analytical skills to help us think more rationally about policy decisions. And that was really a fantastic opportunity. And then went to get more education. So I went to Harvard and met my future husband. And my life kind of got all thrown up in the air because I was convinced I was going to stay in the government economic service for the rest of my life. I loved it. And he was American, so then I had to start looking for, after failing to persuade him to move to the UK, had to look for something to do in the US. So then I went back to my old love of development, having, I think, gained some skills, and worked representing the UK at the IMF and World Bank, and learned a lot about international institutions, worked on financial regulation in Russia as a way to move to Boston, where Michael was. That all went up in smoke because of a big scandal that hit Harvard and its work in Russia. So I went back to the IMF, and I realized that I needed more economics to really make a difference. And so I went back and did a PhD, but I did it part-time. And a lot of people worry about this trade-off, and it's much harder to do what I did. I was constantly on the border between academia and policy work. And I think that's a really interesting and important nexus, where when I was within government, I was taking academic work and explaining how, and translating it into the policy needs. So, how can we use this academic work to do our research, our policy work better? And then I moved to JPAL, whereas on the other side of the fence, I was in academia, but I was helping academia translate what it was doing into the policy world. So I helped found JPAL at MIT, which promoted the use of randomized trials, but there was a lot of academics doing randomized trials. I think the key thing that JPAL did was work really hard on this policy academic nexus of saying, how do we make sure that this academic work is being translated into policy change? And that's the area that's the thing that's been common throughout my work. And so, yet again, I've jumped back onto the other side of the bridge, and I'm now working at the Department for International Development, back in the Government Economic Service that I started in all that time ago as chief economist, and again, helping to bring the academic insights, the research insights into decisions in government. And there's so much need for that translation across this border.
I think that's super interesting for, as you said, an 80,000 hours podcast audience that's thinking a lot about their careers, but also as we sit here at EA Global London, I think a lot of attendees are trying to figure out how they can shape their own careers for the most impact. And it strikes me that one of the kind of central questions people are asking themselves often is, should I go and do direct work now, or should I kind of focus on upskilling myself and becoming a more powerful person in whatever domain? It seems like you have kind of climbed those two ladders alternatingly throughout your career. Is that a model that you would recommend to others?
So as I say, so first of all, let me just say upskilling is not only in academia, right? You don't just do it in graduate school. So I think the place where I learned most, as I say, was probably those first 2 years in the Government Economic Service. I was never trained to write until someone literally went line by line through my work in government to help me write more clearly. And that's been incredibly important in conveying ideas. So you learn different things. So that you learn technical things when you go to college and graduate school, and you learn other skills, like how to influence people, how to get things done, how to run effective organizations. You need both of those skills if you want to make a difference in the world. And different people will have preferences or skills that side more on the influencing people or more on the technical side. So think about where your best skills are. I wrote a blog a while ago about whether economists should go into policy or academia, and I kind of listed the skills that you needed in these different things and didn't say one is better than the other or one is harder than the other. It's just different. So think about your skills, and then think about acquiring and building on your natural skills, both within institutions and through more formal training. I do think for me, and something that people often underestimate, is the amount of skills you learn from being in an effective organization. So a lot of people want to start their own organization, and that's great. But I have seen people start organizations without having really experienced an effective organization. And you learn, as someone who, we were within MIT, but we were building an organization. When I arrived at JPL, there were 3 people, right? And when I left, there were 350 people. So as a team, we built an organization. And my deputy and I had both come from the civil service. And we had really strong views about how you run an effective organization. And I think that was absolutely critical in building JPL.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating and very apt. My background is in the software startup world, which is quite different, but often young people will ask me, how can they start their own company or whatever, and I always say, work for a great company before you even think about trying to start one of your own, because there's a lot that you don't want to have to sort of reinvent from scratch or try to derive from first principles. So you mentioned controlled trials, and that's definitely a big subject in your work. Before kind of diving into the current state of that debate, maybe just kind of another historical question. I mean, you started out in an era when that was much less of a concern, right? And it was more about just kind of giving and feeling good about it and maybe hoping for the best, or maybe not even really worrying so much about what happened downstream. How would you sketch the kind of intellectual trajectory of aid and development work over the last 3 decades?
Right, big questions. I think it's worth looking at 2 different trajectories. So there's the trajectory of the aid sector or the development sector, and then there's the trajectory of the kind of academic research on development. And those are a bit different, and one of the nice things about RCTs is they've brought those 2 really closely together. I think the trajectory of the aid sector has been one in which, as you say, there was not enough emphasis, in my view, about understanding really rigorously what works. So there was a lot of different theories and views about what we should be doing, and you see these big swings and fads between the view that development was mainly about investment in physical capital. We should, the reason for aid is just that countries don't have enough investment, and so we should be building stuff. And, the places like India had 5-year plans, and they built steel factories, and then there was a big swing saying, no, we need to worry about human capital, and not just, steel, and because we can grow, but people aren't benefiting, people aren't, they're still malnourished, they're not learning. And you see these big swings in interest about what we should be doing for development. And not a lot of it was very based on data. And there has been a really big change in the last 10 years or so, especially in some of within DFID and within the World Bank, to really seriously think about what is the evidence behind the decisions that we're making. And one of the reasons I moved to DFID is it has been one of the aid agencies that has, I think, changed the most to constantly be questioning ourselves. So we're going through that whole process at the moment of saying, looking at what we're doing and saying, is it really evidence-based? What's the new research say? What stuff should we stop doing because the new evidence is saying we shouldn't be doing that? And that really is an important sea change in the aid world. Within academia, where most of the RCTs are happening, I think there you see a slightly different, or RCTs are part of a much bigger change, which is about, again, thinking carefully about what's the causal effect. So there's a lot of work on descriptively what's happening in developing countries, which I think is really important. There was quite a lot of kind of focus on ideology, I think, which I think there's been some move away from. But to be honest, just not a lot of work happening on development. One of the biggest changes in research in academia and economics is just there are a lot more people thinking about the developing world, and that's great. And a lot of them are doing RCTs, but if you look at the data, actually there's just as much non-RCT work as there was before. There's now more RCT work, and there's just more people. And there's been development was kind of a bit off the side. And it was, people thought about different issues, and what people have realized is the questions in development are actually very similar to the questions in other bits of economics, and we should be learning from each other. So you've seen things that have been discovered in the developing world, like, a lot of behavioral economics lessons came from development, and they're now being taken up and used and learned from in rich countries. And I think that better integration of development into kind of, understanding that we're all the same and there are a lot of similarities and a lot to learn, I think that's been really important to see that lessons going in both directions.
So moving to RCTs in general and sort of the state of debate around how much we should rely upon them, you mentioned that it's kind of a 50-50 split right now in today's work. Do you think that's an appropriate split? Do you think that it should be all RCTs? What do you think is kind of the right balance as we try to figure out what is obviously a very complicated world?
Yeah, so I think I think it's really important to say that all of us who have worked on randomized trials have never suggested that this is the only methodology that you should use. Sometimes it's held up as a straw person that, we go around saying this is the only methodology, and people criticize us for saying it's the only methodology, but nobody who's done RCTs has ever thought that that's the right approach. I think the right way to see things is, you have a toolbox of ways to answer questions, and the right tool depends on the question that you're asking. So I think we need good descriptive work to understand what the problems are. Like, a lot of development programs just fail because they're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. They're just solving the wrong problem. So the first really important thing you've got to do is really understand what the issue is in any given area. So, if we're worried about girls not going to school because of menstruation, well, let's start by finding out whether they actually don't go to school more when they're menstruating. Like, that's a kind of really basic, obvious thing, but we actually need more work on that kind of, understanding your context, understanding the problem is really important first step. So when I started doing agriculture work in Sierra Leone, the first thing we did was work with the government to kind of do a really detailed analysis of what are the problems for smallholder farmers in Sierra Leone. Not RCT, just kind of descriptive. And it turned up all sorts of interesting facts that kind of people weren't aware of. So I think that's really important. I think then doing an RCT is useful for answering a really specific problem, a really specific question. But I think the best RCTs are ones that test a theory. So they test something that's more generalizable than just this, does this program work? It's asking a question about human beings. So if we think about, here's an example. So I did a project looking at how to improve immunization rates in India, which was fantastically effective. And we did it started with a first assessment of what are the health problems in this area. And only 3% of kids in this part of India were getting fully immunized. And given that immunization is one of the most effective things that you could do, that rate is just appallingly low. So there were a number of theories about why that could be, and a lot of people said, well, people here don't trust the doctors, or not doctors, because you rarely get doctors in rural India or rural anywhere, but nurses in clinics. So they don't trust the formal health system. There was also a question of, so the clinics are often closed. So is that the problem? Like, is it that when you go and take your kid to the clinic, it's often closed? Is it nurse absenteeism that's the problem? Or is it just a behavioral economics thing that you're happy to get your kid immunized, but you'll do it tomorrow? So we'd read all this behavioral economics, and we said, well, maybe we should look at that. But we also wanted to test these other ideas. So one arm provided just regular, made sure that without fail, there was someone to immunize your child. And another arm did that, but also provide a small incentive. So yes, we were testing a program, but we were also asking a more fundamental question, which is, why don't people get their kids immunized? And what we saw in the data is a lot of people got their kid immunized with one immunization, but they failed to persist to the end of the schedule, which already, that's just descriptive data, and it starts to tell you it's not that they distrust the system or that they think that immunizations are evil, because they're getting their kid one immunization. It's more a question of persistence. And so now, fixing the supply problem increased the number of people getting the first shot and the second shot, but again, it failed to fix this persistence problem. Where the immunization effect, the incentive effect worked, was it helped people persist to the end. And so that tells you that one of the big problems was this persistence problem. And it tells you a lot about why immunization isn't happening. Now, that project was completely impossible to scale, right? We were handing out lentils in the middle of Rajasthan where nobody showed up, and it was just, you would never do, this was like economists designing logistics. It was a disaster. I mean, we learned a lot, but you would never want to actually do a program like this. So, and a colleague of mine did, something similar where another program in Rajasthan where we ended up, improving teachers' attendance by having cameras that were wrapped in sellotape and signed. Again, it was the logistics was a nightmare, but it tested a theory. And so once you have that, you can think about what's the implementation issues. How do we implement this at scale? Because you better understand the problem. So, sorry, that was a really long answer to the question, but you want to use an RCT when you can test a specific problem that is broadly, and get an answer to why something is an issue. It's an important question, you can answer it well, and it has broader implications. But you also need to use other types of methodology when your question is of a different kind.
So I'd love to kind of hear, I have a number of questions to follow up on that. It seems that what you're describing there involves travel, for one thing. You've mentioned travel kind of a couple times already in your answers, and I also noticed on your website that the kind of header illustration seems to be of you both in the field and then sort of in a more academic setting, which is like a clear signal that you believe in actually going to places and handing out the lentils, as it were. So it seems like in that example that you cite, you have a pretty on-the-ground, kind of intuitive, first-hand understanding, and that allows you to generate a number of theories, and then you can test one of those theories, or test multiple of those theories, and find an effect, and then you can sort of think about, okay, now how can we sort of scale this up in such a way where we can sort of simplify the logistics and, not have to handle all the lentils personally. That seems pretty sound. I think one thing that people worry a lot about is how that then transfers to another context. So, could we take that result and say, well, it's not, the incentive will work for persistence, and take that to another culture or another place and expect similar results. When tested, that seems to have mixed results, and you can maybe summarize the state of the evidence there as you see it for us. But speak to that a little bit. How can you take that experience, even when you're pretty confident that it works in one place, and try to generalize it to other places?
So I think the discussion around generalizability is really confused. So let me try and explain how I think about it. So people often ask, does this result generalize? To which I respond, what result? So what aspect of this are you asking about generalizability? So I think there's three different main ways in which you need to think about whether something generalizes. So the first is the problem the same in other places? Right? So it's not going to generalize to a place that doesn't have the problem. So in this case, the problem was that you have people getting the first immunization, but they weren't persisting to the end of the schedule. And that's really easy. That's something that you can test. You can look at data, and you can say, well, in this country, people are willing to get the first immunization, but they don't manage to persist to the end. And in other places, they're not getting the first immunization. So the first question to ask is the problem a common problem? Right? The second, and so something's not going to generalize if the problem isn't the same. The second question is, if there's that problem, do people behave in a similar way in different contexts? Right? So does a small incentive help people to persist in something that they want to do, but they kind of don't manage to do consistently? And there is tons of evidence that that is true. It's not all from, lentils and vaccines. It's from across many different kinds of programs. Right? But that general finding about people, and that we procrastinate, that we fail to persist, that incentives that we are short-term, when we're short-term, small nudges are useful, that is actually very generalizable. And when we did a survey looked at the literature from RCTs on health policy, we found a number of really consistent basic things about how people behave, which are really consistent across different studies. So pricing for preventative health. So people, if you charge for preventative health, you will see a big decline in take-up. That is something that has been consistently found on different kinds of preventative health in different countries. Very consistent. Then the last thing is, it was implemented in this place. Can I implement something similar elsewhere? And that is not something that automatically generalizes. So we worked with an extremely good NGO in Rajasthan. Their people would absolutely turn up. They could get the lentils there. They could, the lentils were not stolen. That would not necessarily be the case if we brought it to another organization, to a government. And also, we wouldn't want to use lentils if we did the program in New York, right? Lentils wouldn't be seen as particularly exciting incentive in other places. So people confuse these three things and kind of lump them into things don't generalize. Well, human behavior, basic fundamental principles of human behavior generalize, logistics don't. So that is where you need to spend a lot of time understanding the local context, understanding how to run logistics locally. And yes, coming back to the beginning of your question, I do spend less now than I would like, but in the past, I do spend a lot of time on the ground. And anyone thinking about working in this area, it's absolutely critical that you spend a lot of time on the ground and really understand the local context in which you want to have an impact. And more importantly, you need to partner with people who really understand. So nearly always when I work in these countries, I am working with a partner who has worked there for many years, who I completely trust to understand the local context. And then we build a relationship where they trust me and I trust them, because they trust me because I'm willing to spend the time and effort understanding their problems. And I trust them because I've spent enough time to know that they really know the local context. So that's absolutely fundamental for anyone thinking about a career in development and global poverty. I would also say, when we're talking about careers, it's a lot easier to do that when you're younger and less established. So get out there and spend some time on the ground.
How long do you typically spend in a place as you and this may have changed over time, but I'm reminded of I don't know if it's a joke or a proverb, but the guy who goes to China for a week thinks he knows a little bit about China. A month thinks he knows a lot about China. And then after a year, realizes he knows nothing about China. So I wonder how long you feel, or have experience in practice, that you kind of have to be in a place to build the right relationships, to have the level of trust that you need to actually be effective.
Yeah, so it's, again, part of it is based on partnership. So I don't always have to be there all the time if I'm kind of building relationships and talking to people regularly. And I have not done what I would advise other people to do, because I didn't go into development initially. I didn't spend kind of a year or two on the ground as a student, in my early 20s, which I wish I had done. Although I kind of surround myself with people who do. So I will often now go only for a week or so, but then I will go back repeatedly. So I've been working in Sierra Leone since 2004. And when you go and you're in a cab or you meet someone, they say, "Oh, first time in Sierra Leone." You're like, "No, maybe kind of the 50th." Like, really? So. And it's that kind of repeated interaction, and then I'm on the phone with people every week who are there. I have worked with colleagues there who've been there all their lives. So it's kind of building that knowledge over time, but so it's being there, yes, and building the connections, but then you can kind of rely on those connections by keeping them going over time.
So the answer is that's a lot of time over years, really. I mean, this is not something that can be accomplished quickly at all.
Yes, but then some of that translates when you go to, other countries. I think there's a mind shift that takes place when you've learned a developing country quite well. There's a lot of really interesting work in behavioral economics now, which is not about nudges, but is about how the pressure of poverty changes how people think, how people make decisions, and just the constraints that you face. And it's just very hard for us initially to understand just how different people's lives are and just how constrained the decisions that the environment in which they have to make decisions are. And in some ways, once you get that once, it really helps with the next context. Now, that doesn't help you with, oh my God, you should never do your slides in green because that's the color of, one of the political parties, and they'll think that you're linked with that political party. I mean, there's kind of those sort of local nuances that you will not get, that are not transferable to one country to another. But I think some of the most basic things that you really get after you've spent some time is this more fundamental kind of mind shift about, okay, I get it, why people are making these decisions, because when you haven't had much sleep, when you haven't had enough to eat, you just make decisions differently. It's not great to be asking people to, spend a lot of time going to community meetings when they have so much else on their plate. And the fact that all these things that are done for us in a rich society, we have chlorine put in our water, we get reminders, we can't send our kids to school unless they've been immunized. Like all of this stuff, all of these decisions are just made for us. And understanding that really poor people in poor environments have to make those decisions and do those things for themselves. They have to build, in Sierra Leone, they have to mend the roads themselves. They have to do all the local public services that we get. Our trash gets picked up for us. All these things that we just automatically do so we can get on with the rest of our lives, they have to do for themselves. And somehow, a lot of those things are actually common across many different societies. So kind of invest in one and some of it will translate, and then just be open and aware that you need to learn from others about, as I say, the kind of don't use green or don't use, orange means something very specific in India. Those kinds of things, be aware that you have to be careful of that sort of thing and ask locally before you put your foot in it.
So that discussion of poverty and the effects that poverty has maybe is sort of a reconciliation of a couple things I've been kind of wrestling with as I've been listening to you, which is on the one hand, the notion that people are pretty much the same. You seem to be sort of advocating for a pretty universalist, human nature. At the same time, I'm well aware of the weird phenomenon and that, at least in through my filter bubble, it seems that I should be very careful about generalizing even a pretty well-established batch of studies or results from the sort of, Ivy League classrooms where they may have been originally conducted. Do you think that, first of all, maybe you reject that notion of the weird phenomenon, but if it is real, is it maybe that poverty is sort of the fault line along which different behaviors sort of split?
So again, I think it's important to make a distinction between sort of some of the more theoretical, you kind of have to go up a level of abstraction and then things generalize more. So as I say, things like procrastination we procrastinate over different things in different contexts, but we all procrastinate. So that's one reason. So there's differences about what are the decisions I'm having to make on a day-to-day basis, but some of the ways in which we as human beings respond to those decisions are very common. The thing that's different is it's just harder for the poor, right? So all the things that we fail at, that we're not very good at making decisions, they're much easier for us because we've had a good night's sleep and we have enough nutrition. Like it's very well established now that people are more short-termist when they're hungry. So even the same people in Kenya, the same farmers in Kenya before and after the harvest will make different decisions, and they will be more short-termist and fall into more behavioral economics traps before the harvest when they're hungry and they haven't had enough to eat. So those traps, those behavioral economics things are actually common across all people, but it's just harder for people who haven't had enough sleep, are in a noisy environment, and are hungry to do those things. So we just have to be aware of those. We have to be aware of the pressures on people. So, well, why aren't people saving? Why aren't they taking the good investment option? Well, if you understand all the other constraints they face, that becomes more understandable. So I think it may be hard to fit together, but in my mind, those are completely consistent, that we as humans are very similar across very different contexts. But the poor just have it harder, and it's harder to make those decisions. Now, obviously, there are also really important differences that you have to take into account. I think one of the things that is different across contexts that you really have to think about carefully is gender. So the gender constraints, the constraints on women in different contexts are very different. And you have to take that into account when you're designing programs. So I do a lot of work in Bangladesh, and mobility is highly constricted for women and for adolescent girls. And so when you're designing things, you just have to understand that women won't be able to walk to get to somewhere. They won't be able to avail themselves of the program because it will be very hard for them to be let outside their household on their own. And it's hard to persuade other people to take them. And so they're kind of these practical constraints that you have to take into account and understand in a local context. But that's not about humans being different. It's just that comes back to this logistics. As I say, there's kind of three levels. What's the problem? What's the underlying human mechanism, which generalizes a lot? And then there's logistics. And you really have to understand the local constraints when you design your logistics. But let's keep those three boxes separate and think about them separately, and we'll just design things, our designs will be much more practical if we do that.
So I think that's a great transition to the next set of questions that I have on the importance of policy reform and maybe a growth-oriented agenda. So Tyler Cowen, who was a recent guest on the 80,000 Hours podcast, just published a book in which he basically argues that the number one focus should be on economic growth. That's where almost all of the good that we enjoy comes from, subject to some constraints based on just general human rights. I think he has a pretty intuitive approach to what exactly that definition is. But it seems like you would kind of broadly agree with the emphasis on growth. At the same time, some have argued that the focus on RCTs and sort of what has been called the aid effectiveness craze, quote unquote, is focusing our attention on small issues that maybe are distracting from the bigger questions of broad economic growth and kind of progress in these societies. So do you think that is a valid worry, and how do you square those two kind of levels of very small and just society-wide capability building?
Right. So I think there's a number of different things going on here. One, I first need to object to, which is the characterization of RCTs as aid effectiveness. So most of the work on RCTs has not been focused on aid, and I think it's really important to understand this difference, which is most of the money that goes into poverty relief is money spent by people in developing countries, governments, and individuals. And actually, if you look at most of the people doing RCTs, they don't think that their audience is aid donors. Their audience is the government of India and the government of Brazil and the government of Indonesia, and to some extent, big companies or groups, or individuals there. Because that's where the money is, to be honest. So let's just remember there's aid and there's development, and aid is only ever one small part of development. So it's really important to be thinking about focusing on how to improve so I do agree that improving the policies of developing country governments is a hugely important way to impact global poverty. So the RCT craze is not about aid effectiveness, it's about government effectiveness, poverty effectiveness. So that's one slight quibble. Then there's the question, then there's kind of the heart of your question, which is policy, versus working on small questions. So first, and then there's, should we be thinking, well, do RCTs work on small questions? And then there's, how do we think about development versus, say, working on improving someone's health or education now? Again, those are, I think, two different questions. So I think actually, as I was explaining a bit before, I think RCT should not be seen as looking at testing this specific program. They should be they should be seen as testing big questions that can then influence policy. So, for example, you might test a specific project on education, and that's going to help you. A lot of the work on education has suggested that the most effective thing that we can do in education is is to focus on the learning within the classroom. It's not about more money, it's not about more textbooks, it's not about, and that's what governments spend their money on. They spend it on teachers and textbooks, mainly teachers. But more teachers doesn't actually improve learning. More textbooks doesn't improve learning. But that's what the Indian government is spending their money on. So if I want to help the Indian government on education, I want to test those different things about how the Indian government could improve their education and then help them reform the education system. And what this set of RCTs has suggested is not just that it's about the pedagogy, but it's specifically about the problem that the Indian curriculum is up here and most kids are here. So if you look at the data, there's just descriptive data, again, the power of descriptive data. Within a kind of average Indian classroom, in 9th grade, none of the kids are even close to the 9th grade curriculum. They're testing it somewhere between 2nd grade and 6th grade. Now, no wonder they're not learning very much, because the only thing that a teacher has to do by law in India is complete the curriculum, even if the kids have no idea what they're talking about. So, yes, you had RCTs testing very specific interventions. All of the ones that worked were ones that got the teaching down from the 9th grade curriculum to a level that the kids could actually understand. Now, the lesson from that, the big lesson to the Indian government, if they were ever to agree to this, is change your curriculum. Like, that's the biggest thing that you could do. Reform the curriculum and make it more appropriate to what children are doing. So yes, you're testing little things, but you're coming out with big answers. And that's what, people like Angus don't seem to be able to, who came up with some of this critiques, that's what they don't kind of understand. Now, the final part, and I think the hardest part is economic development versus, say, working on health and education. And, at DFID, we have shifted a lot of emphasis relatively recently into trying to do more on economic transformation, under the recognition that the biggest reductions in poverty, as you say, have come from big transformations in economic policy. So the big opening up of India and China towards more market-oriented economies, and I'm not saying markets solve everything, they absolutely don't. But when you've got a system as screwed up as communist China, making prices have some influence moves you an awful long way, and can really help transform the economy. So, and the same happened in India, and you saw massive reductions in poverty by just sort of a move towards a slightly more sensible economic policy. So when I was recently doing my kind of ranking of what are kind of the most effective things that DFID could do, we were saying, well, if there are cases of countries that are kind of as screwed up as China, and I won't list the ones that we listed now in fear of embarrassing some people, but where things are that screwed up, helping them move to a more effective economic management, that's got to be the most effective thing that we could do for poverty. You can't do that as an outside donor unless someone's willing to do it. So where you see, I'd say Ethiopia at the moment is going through a tremendous reform. And we really ought to be focusing attention and helping Ethiopia in that transition. Tremendous potential, because they're absolutely fundamentally changing policy there in ways that could be really beneficial to the poor. So jump on those opportunities. But you can't really make them happen. That's something that the developing country themselves has to decide to do. Then help them as much as you can. Then there's the question of what do you do to promote economic development in countries that aren't kind of going through this kind of fundamental reform process. You can nudge them a bit in the right way. You can maybe help help improve trade policy. You can help reduce trade barriers. There's things that you can do. But in a lot of countries, it's not entirely obvious what you can do to promote economic development, to be honest. We need a lot more research, a lot more understanding about how to do that, because I absolutely agree that it's fundamental. But we don't always have all the tools that we need to make economic transformation happen. Now, think about our own economies and it's not that we only ever worry about economics development. We also worry about health and education, right? Because we don't grow in order to have more money. We grow to have better lives. So we want to make sure that that money translates into actually better lives. So we need to be thinking about poverty relief domestically, within developing countries, health and education. And we know a lot about how to do that well. So we need both to take the opportunities for economic development growth when we can, and really come in there heavily where there's an opportunity. But we also need to be working on health and education, not least because we know that those things are really important for economic development, right? We know that there's a high return, there's high productivity improvements if kids are given the right nutrition early on. There's about a 10% return to investing in education. So to some extent, you can't have economic transformation without the building blocks of human capital. In the classic economic growth model, there's human capital, people, and physical capital. If you want growth, you need to be working on all of those things.
So I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't get to the famous section of these podcasts where we do the overrated, underrated quick hit list.
Okay.
And so I'll give you a number of prompts, and you can respond with overrated or underrated. And of course, you're free to pass on any of them if you don't have a strong view or would rather just avoid the topic. And then maybe we'll circle back to a little bit more career advice for the audience as we close. So the first one, overrated, underrated, charter cities as a means of promoting the sort of growth that we're talking about.
I'm not a fan of charter cities. But I don't think anyone else is either, apart from, one Nobel Prize winner.
How about going along to get along with your colleagues?
So I think it's really important to learn how to influence and how to get along with your colleagues if you're going to make change. So underrated.
Starting a business in the developing world?
Probably underrated. Social entrepreneurship, overrated. Business, underrated.
And how would you draw a line between those?
So social entrepreneurship is I don't want to get in trouble for sort of dumping on some specific things, but small things that you help, developing a solar torch to sell to people. Many of those do not take off in a big way, partly because people don't have a lot of money. And I think you could have a much bigger impact by working in big organizations. I do think that there's a lot of evidence that businesses in the developing world are really badly managed. And there's a lot of improvements that could be made. And basically, people want jobs. So they don't want money to create their own businesses. They want jobs. So managing to get good, effective private sector businesses working in these countries is is really important. Now, whether this audience is, well-placed to run those companies is a question. But I know people who've spent many years in development, working as NGOs or working as RAs for me, who, set up businesses, and I think that's great.
How about cash transfers?
So cash transfers, I think, were very high, appropriately. People have been a little bit down on them recently because of some recent work saying maybe the long-term impacts of one of them wasn't as much as people had hoped. But I think when you look at the literature as a whole, I think it's very positive, including on the long-term benefits. And even if the control group catches up, getting people out of poverty earlier is still really beneficial.
Once
Again,
was
it depends.
appropriately rated, now underrated.
Yeah, exactly. Was appropriately rated, now perhaps underrated.
Okay, how about gene drives for mosquito and other disease vector control?
Okay, I'm going to pass on that. I don't know enough about that.
Maybe this one as well. Genetically modified and CRISPR crops.
So I don't know about CRISPR crops, but I'm a big fan of GM crops and particularly just improved agricultural varieties in the developing world, hugely beneficial. Now, some of that you can get without GM, but I think we're probably a little bit paranoid about GM.
How about cracking down on tax havens or other sources of illicit financial flows?
Underrated. So we should do more of that.
What's the mechanism by which that benefits everyone?
So a huge amount of money flows out of developing countries into tax havens. So it's not really about developed world tax havens. It's also a big problem in terms of fueling corruption. We in the West, there's a big opportunity for exposing the bad deals that are done with bad governments in developing countries that are often done in the West. And we have a huge culpability for that, and we ought to be doing more to stop it. And I'm pleased to say that DFID is doing more work on that.
Micronutrient supplementation.
So micronutrients, underrated. Supplementation, we still need more work on that because it's the way we're putting micronutrients out at the moment doesn't seem to be working very well. So anemia is probably underrated. It's a huge, huge problem. It really affects productivity. It affects cognition. It's a major problem. We haven't quite figured out how to address it, though. So problem is underrated. Solution needs a lot more work.
Reforming developing country macroeconomic policy. I guess we've kind of covered that.
Yeah, so macroeconomic policy is really important, but we've actually kind of figured it out. Like, if you look at inflation, it used to be a major problem. When I was doing development economics, half of the course was about how to deal with hyperinflation. Virtually nobody has hyperinflation anymore. It's a real major success that we don't talk about enough. So it's really important, but maybe I shouldn't, if you're suspicious, I shouldn't say this, but we kind of nailed it.
Okay, a couple more. How about pre-registration?
I think that's overrated. And that's a little funny coming from me because I wrote one of the papers saying that we ought to do more of it in economics. I'm now finding some of the downsides. Yeah, there's a big move to pre-register in advance what your analysis is going to be. And sometimes tying your hands is not actually a good idea. So we need to be a bit careful about pre-registering. So, pre-registering that you're doing a study is really important. Pre-analysis plans, which say, this is exactly how I'm going to analyze my data when it comes out, can be a problem because when you look at the data and stuff has happened in between, you may have to, it may be really important to change how you do your analysis. Plus, I've found referees hate it, so. That's probably less of an issue for this audience.
Do you think that people are not doing that extended analysis, or that it's being just unfairly dismissed as a result of the pre-registration?
I think so. I think the right way to, so I understand that people worry that you run a trial and then you test your results on like 50 different outcomes, and you promote the one that had a positive effect. Most academic work doesn't work quite like that because you would never, your referees force you to show 50 robustness checks, and and you don't get passed if only one of them had a positive effect. I think we need to rely a bit more on theory. Like, theory tells you which things should go together, which things should be important. And I think theory can be as an effective way of kind of looking at the data and pulling out patterns, and is a bit of tying your hands, and might be a more effective way of tying your hands than pre-analysis plans. I'm not saying you should never do them, they're not the simple answer that people thought they were.
Okay, 2 more overrated and underrated as we begin to transition to a little career advice to close things out. How about reading the news or the newspaper?
So reading the news of the kind that you already support, we should be doing less of. Reading things that shock you out of your, that comes from a different perspective, I think is, we don't do enough of. So I try and read about African politics, for example. It's not on our news normally, but it's really interesting. So reading the news from like serious people who cover African politics, I find, really helpful in just kind of bringing a different perspective. And my son is brilliant at saying, a kind of pushing to say, read what people of different political opinion are saying, just to keep your horizons broader. But I think often when we read the news, we read the things that kind of confirm what we already know, and that's not very helpful.
Last one for overrated, underrated, how about postgraduate degrees?
I don't know the level of these things to say when they're positive.
Yeah, there's kind of 2 levels of analysis here.
Yeah, so I think, it just depends on what you're trying to do with your life.
Okay, well, let's get a little bit more practical then for the last couple minutes as we try to give a little useful advice to the audience. How about in your organization now at DFID, what are the skill sets that you find to be in short supply that you wish there were more young people developing today?
Right, so I think in general the development sector, and this is less DFID, but the development sector in general, I think the development sector really could benefit from the skills of the EA community in the sense of, good hard analysis and linking that to kind of a passion to make change. So, within DFID, I mentor the economists, so the Government Economic Service, who are exactly, along with there's a government statistical service too, but they are exactly that kind of hard analysis type within government. And there's actually a big demand for them, and government in general is desperate for more people to go into the Government Economic Service. So, anyone interested in economics and policy and putting economics to good use should definitely be looking at the Government Economic Service, and DFID especially. I think that ability to use numbers take a hard look at numbers and bring them, think about how they could be used effectively to answer the questions that people have, is really something that's desperately needed within policy. So knowing the, things like economic theory, but also being able to manipulate data sets and, whether it's descriptive data or you're probably not going to run randomized trials within government, but that kind of hard-headed analysis is something that government in the UK and governments around the world really, really need, and it's a really important part of global poverty work.
So I'm not sure
NGOs too, you rarely find good implementing NGOs who are kind of driving, very good at kind of analysis. Take a look, for example, at the work that Caitlin Tulloch is doing with the IRC of just taking all their data and figuring out the cost structure of what they're doing and the variance in costs and what's driving costs to do the same thing. I mean, fantastic way of getting into all that data that NGOs produce lots of data and they don't know what to do with most of it. But having someone really good analytically working with them to kind of really help them understand and use that data effectively. So government is probably slightly better. NGOs desperately need this good analytical work. Obviously, you need an NGO that's willing to listen and wants that. But where they do, tremendous opportunity to make a difference.
So we are probably a bit over time already. Maybe just two last questions to close things out. I don't know how well you know the EA movement and all of the thought that sort of adds up to the movement, but based on your knowledge, do you have a sense for what EAs maybe most understand or most often get wrong about global health and development?
So I think this point about implementation, like the old saying that, it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Like that is so true in development. It is, putting the work into refining the logistics of making something work. Like even once we've figured out what the problem is and we've figured out there's this general solution that is generalized, like actually making it work at scale on the ground is infinite amounts of testing and figuring it out and testing it again, by which testing doesn't necessarily mean randomized trials. I mean, testing can mean we tried an information program, we put up posters, and the next morning none of the posters were there. Like, that's testing, that's like, just the hard sweat and toil of kind of making something work in dysfunctional societies cannot be underestimated, and it needs a lot of effort. And one of the things I meant to say on your earlier question about kind of the evolution of the RCT movement, I think one of the biggest things that it's done in academia is it has brought academics out into the world. All of those working on RCTs are basically running large implementing organizations in developing countries. We're hiring tons of people, we're trying to get things from A to B, we're building stuff, and the amount of insight you gain from trying to run a big organization in a dysfunctional country is unbelievable, and it helps generate the new set of questions. So, I think if anything, that's what people misunderstand. So there's a lot of discussion up here, but kind of a lot of the work is the blood, sweat, and tears of like making it work, making the trains run on time.
Okay, last question for today. What are the best decisions that you've made in your career, and what recommendations, and you've scattered advice throughout this conversation, but what kind of top recommendations would you give to EAs that want to make a difference in your line of work, perhaps as a civil servant?
Yeah. So I guess I'm pretty proud of the work that I did at JPAL. It was kind of a crazy thing to give up my job at the IMF and go start this organization with, as I say, 3 people. We had $300,000 from MIT when we started. So I think, but the lesson there was, it was right at the heart of this point of trying to link what's coming out of research with kind of practical policy. And I think a piece of advice, and again, it's not for everyone. There's a certain skill set and a certain, a certain type of person who will benefit from that. But I think that's an extremely important area that people should at least consider whether they are interested in, because another thing that happens within policy is people get more and more away from, they remember what they did at university, but then don't keep up on the latest literature. And I feel one of the things that's great about the EA community is you're like endlessly curious. You'll keep trying to be up to speed on what's the latest thinking, what's the latest evidence. And that's something, and so if you are in policy, you will be constantly wanting to improve things and constantly willing to reach out and, go the extra mile and read the extra paper and find out what the evidence is saying. And that is so desperately needed in policy.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. We are unfortunately out of time, but how about a big round of applause for Dr. Rachel Glennerster. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, it's your pleasure.